This is Grampie Bagnall, and he's reminiscing, talking about what we call the olden days, or you call the older days, that we grew up in. Some of the people I knew and some of the things that I did during the course of my life, why I did them and why they were important to me. You have to understand farms. It's a two-part situation. Farms up there were individually owned by the farmer that lived on that farm. Later on, all of these farms were gathered together and big landowners came in and did something with the property. In those days, the farmers individually owned what property had been handed down to them through the years. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't good land. There was ledge sticking up in the fields that you were constantly breaking equipment, as I told you earlier. But this happened. And this is potato field. You had to go in and plow it and harrow it. And then you would plant your crops. And you go in and work 3 of your crops. You could plant hay in that field, and raise your crop of hay, plant oats. You could plant beets. Or we didn't raise beets, but they did later. It was a process to make sugar out of it. Mm-hmm. And what I started to say. This is going to be a rough day.
That's all right. You were talking about farming being a two-part operation.
In the spring, you made your annual trip to Ashland, the nearest bank. And you went in and you talked to the banker. And you borrowed enough money to plant the crops you were going to plant. And because you didn't have any money, mm-hmm. You took your butter and eggs to the general store and you got merchandise and trade for it. And there just wasn't any money except what you made in the winter selling pulp or timber. Mm-hmm. And some cash money came in there. However, there was enough money to get the crop into the ground, and this was the big expense. This is what made the farm go. Without the bank loan, you could not have operated the farm the way they did. In the fall, you raise a crop, you sell the crop, mm-hmm. you go back to the bank and pay off the loan you took in the spring, and wound up with nothing. Mm-hmm. But that was the way of life, and they knew that, well, all right, we may have a little bit of cash at the end of the year. There'll be no vacation. They didn't even think of vacation. Mm-hmm. They lived a vacation, just living there in the open air and the farm, people coming to see them, and strangers coming into their yard to look for a loaf of bread or a gallon of milk or whatever they would take to their cottages and get it from the farmer there. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was a remarkable place, and it's hard to express myself. It's just what the farm was. Yeah. It was a living, loving environment of itself. It made it itself, it perpetuated itself. Mm-hmm. And I've never seen anything operate quite like it. I'm sure in Minnesota and Michigan you see places like this. Mm-hmm. Today you've got immense pieces of equipment, and you need 1,000 acres where 100 acres used to be a farm. Mm-hmm. But
you add the animals into the process then too.
Yep.
And they're just as much a part of it as machinery, but also as living members of the community, the way you describe it. And it's a kind of symbiotic. You talk about perpetuates itself.
Yep.
And seems like that's part of it too. You're connected to the land. You're connected to the animals. You're connected to the woods. You're part of the place?
We're now atop Hayward Hill, and we're in front of Fred Stevens' farm. And we're looking at the driveway, which is well worth looking at as far as I'm concerned, because I remember what it looks like. It's probably a good, 1,000 feet anyway, from the road into where the house is. You see the house sitting on top of the hill.
Mm-hmm.
It's yellow, faded yellow. It's been yellow for years and years and years, or had been. And of course it has a barn and the outbuildings and everything else, the chicken house, the machine shop, and all of these things. And the well house, where you have the pump and you carried water to wash clothes, which was the toughest thing. Get all that water up there and then rinse water carried up and already. So, old time stuff. And you had to prime the pump. You leave a can hanging right on the handle of the pump. And you'd take a hand and grab a glass of water down with you, put it in the can and pour it down the throat of the pump so that it made a suction between the pump itself and the side, and you start pumping that thing, and pretty soon you would put enough suction on it to pull the water out the pump. We had one in the yard. The water wasn't quite as good in it. We used that to water the cattle and the cows, and you didn't want to use it all up because they had to get water. The other well was on down the hill in the lowland, so it was further away from the house, and it was my job to go and get the water and carry it up, wash your hands with. And you go in, there was a, let me backtrack. You're out on the highway now. And I was telling you about the driveway. It made quite an impression on me because I told you what the length of the thing was approximately. It was lined on both sides of this gravel driveway, which they had built, were these tall, stately elm trees, beautiful trees. And they went all the way into the house. That driveway went in. There was a driveway to go up into the front of the house that sat there, but nobody ever used it. It was there and could be used. You went around to the east side of the house and parked actually behind it from where I'm describing the house. People used to come and drive into their yard and blow their horn. And when you went out to the yard to see who was blowing the horn, they would say, I'd like to have a dozen eggs, or I'd like 2 pounds of butter. These were people who were summer people or camping people for a weekend that were coming down on Portage Lake. And they knew they had been there before. This was old hat. They knew you just went up and blew the horn up there. You could ask for these things and you'd get them. You could get a pint of milk. You could get a pint of cream. You could get butter. You could get eggs. It was there. That's what they did on the farm. This was my grandmother's chores. But in front of the house, on the west side, was a grove of elm trees, a great big grove that must have been, I'd guess, 300 feet deep. And it's set up on a hill right in front of the house. The house was built on the same hill so that you could walk out and walk right into this grove of trees. And years ago, they had taken wide planks and they had nailed them along these elm trees so that there were benches all around this area so that you could go out and play games out there and have picnics and socialize. generally there was a tent behind the thing to the north where we would sleep nights.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody would have a tent, and we'd put the tent up, and we would sleep out in it and lie and tell stories and all the things that fellows and boys do. And we would sleep out there at night. So it was a fairly constant
Mm-hmm.
figure. And you could go right around the north end of the house on that road and come into the yard where everybody stopped to purchase their eggs and things. There was a well house right there, and it was the well house where we got the water for the cattle and for the horses. All right. On the east side of that big area that was there, and it was big because the trucks were in there and the tractors were in there and all this business, so there was room that you could maneuver these things. It also was the area where they hauled the hay in out of the field, and it came in and it would park and go into the barn. But on the west side of this area was the barn.
Mm-hmm.
It was higher than 2 stories, but there were only 2 active stories. The rest was peaked roof. And so that's beginning to shape up the driveway, the back of the house. This was the active area of the house, but it was the back of it. The front of it was sort of a Sunday go-to-meeting picnic type of area under the elm trees. On the 4th of July, there was an old gear that was hollow through the shaft.
Mm-hmm.
It must have weighed 200 pounds, but they used to take it and drive a wooden plug in the end of it to completely plug the end of it and load the chamber back here with black powder and fuse. And on the 4th of July, they would shoot this, and that plug was flying. This was the big event of the 4th of July, you know. And they always had a picnic on the 4th of July. And relatives from all over the Aroostook County were there for the events and what all.
For the firing of the homemade cannon.
And firing of the cannon, yeah. And it was one guy, my uncle, my mother's brother,
Mm-hmm.
Herbert. Nice fellow, nice young fellow. I liked him as well as anybody on the farm. Because even though he was older, he always took time with us, the kids.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't too old to appreciate having been a kid, and he was good to us, with us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, back to the big area. The barn I have described as sitting on the west side of the wide open area between them. You came out the back door of the house,
Mm-hmm.
and you go through the shed. Well, the shed is the back part of the house. The house is here, and I'll describe the interior of the house in a bit. But as you came out, you walked through a shed, which was actually a barn establishment. In there, they stored paint, and there was one side of it where they did all their machinery work, any repairs and sharpening of tools and cutters and things of this nature. It's where they did the wash. They had their washing machine, which was one with a mangler on it.
Mm-hmm.
Mangler for good reason, because many an arm has gone through those rollers that
Mm-hmm.
squeeze the clothing and get the water out of them. They were in there, and they also used that to shell peas with. And peas all over the place that was happening. But the woodshed was attached to the back part of this shed, and up over the top of the shed, you went up shed stairs, and you had one of these American picker situations up there. You didn't know what was up there. It was collected all the junk.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't throw anything away because you'd be working on a tool or something down at the workbench. And we haven't got one of those. Let's go look up, see if there's one upstairs. And you might find something you'd pick apart off.
Yep.
So you didn't throw it away. Maybe I can use that one day. And but then it also had the most important room in the house. We didn't have any indoor plumbing at all. The outhouse was out there. So if you went or had to go at 2 o'clock in the morning, if you weren't sufficient to have tools available in the bedrooms, you had to dash through the house, down the hallway to the shed, through the shed to the outhouse, and we had a 3-holer. So one of them was a kid's hole. Made low so that the kid could climb up on it. But it was nothing but a sluice box that was down there, and you would keep eyeballing that for years until it would get to a certain height and say, I'm going to have to move this sled out of there and clean that up. So we'd haul it out and go dispose of whatever needed done. But the outhouse, it was an essential place. And you didn't dawdle in there because somebody else might have to go. And generally, any farmhouse up there had a lot of people living in it, all the kids, and hired hands, and everything else. And so that was pretty much what the house looked like. The barn was a 2-story barn. Actually, it was 3-story when we counted the peak. And it was divided into hay mows of 12. This is a mow, and you could just, they had terminology for it. It's the back one, or the middle one, and so on. So that you would stack the hay away, we brought it up, you put it in each of these things, and somebody would be up there to catch the hay as it came into that section of the mow, and you would spread the hay around nicely and stamp it all down so that you could get as much as possible in there. But you needed it actually aerated in good shape so that many a fire was caused because they put damp hay or wet hay in there or green hay, and the heat generated from it set the barn on fire. So you had to be very careful of this. You had to cure the hay in the fields and dry it before you ever picked it up. And so we had 3 of those mows in the back part of the barn, 2 more small ones along the side. And what they had was a conveyor system, the likes of which I was amazed at how they ever figured out how to use block and tackle and where to attach it in the barn so that they could go to the wagon pulling hay in, and they would drive the fork, which was a U-shaped arrangement, which they would stand on and drive it down into the hay and pull up the handles on it, and it twisted the points on the bottom so that it held a great amount of hay. And that is where I came in. This is one of the first jobs I ever had. I would take the horse and hook it to the end of the rope outside the barn. And it was my job when they said, go with it, is to take the horse and let the horse go all the way across that yard out there that's so big. And when he did, of course, the block and tackle was rigged so that the fork would hold this big bundle of hay and take it up. It would go across the top of the barn, and they could direct it into any one of these mouths that they wanted to put it into. And they would yank it, and that would trip the 2 things holding the
down it goes.
Down it goes, and somebody up in there passing the hay around.
while you back the horse up.
Well, yeah, I disconnect the horse at that point because there was no weight on it.
Right.
Or I could bring it up the tackle in, and it was ready to go again too. But that was one of the first jobs I had as a little kid, was to just lead the horse and see that he moved when we told him to move. So I began to learn how to be a farmer at that point. And there also, down on the ground floor now, along the north side, down below it, miles up above it, loaded with hay, you had, of course, in the winter, the cows can't be outside. They have to be inside and stay in there all winter. We used to let them out on the best of days, roam around as best they can, and then bring them back in.
Right.
Each one of them knew its own spot and would go to it and go there. And there were doors in the front of it so that you could open it, put a pail of water in front of each cow, and we did that. I got quite proficient at going out to the well, pump a bucket full of water, coming in and seeing that the cows got the water they needed. And you would throw down whatever hay they were going to eat from up in the mow, and it would fall on the central floor, which was a big area. And you would throw it into the bin in front of the cow, and he had his own trough in there that you filled with that. There was also generally a container in there built in that held oats. And once in a while, he would get a share of oats. So that on the other side of the barn now, ground floor, was our granary. And when we thrashed oats or wheat, whatever we had, that material, with the straw removed, it was just pure grain. It was put into the granary and into the great big bin in there. We would go in and we would measure out. You didn't want a cow to get too much oats. He would eat them all, they'd bloat up and everything else. So you had a certain amount that you doled out to the cow, and you didn't get it every day. It was a treat when they had it, but it was necessary to give them to them. They needed it. And these were all milk cows. They were in there, and they'd stay there all winter. In the summer, we'd let them loose. And that was one of my jobs, too, was to get up at 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning, go on out into the pastures, and find where the cattle were, where they'd spend the night, and bring them back in. They were normally quite anxious to come in because their udders would be full of milk, and they wanted to be milked. They needed to be. And you bring those back in, and it just opened the back door into the pasture. And they know their own place, their own stall, and they would come in and stay in that stall, which was fine. And so the grain was right there, the hay was right there. And I used to lead the horse. Big man on the farm, you know. Okay, so this was, well, we raised cattle so that we could have milk and butter to sell to my uncle's store and to people that came up there and wanted to buy it, and to some homes. We would deliver these products right to their homes and put it in a refrigerator for them. Well, refrigerator, they didn't have any, they had ice boxes.
Right.
And, interesting. But just beyond the granary was another building. And that was where we kept the two horses. Each had a big stall in there, and each got an allotment of oats every day, as I recall it, and hay. And I used to do that. And on the day that the horse was a little ornery, you had to walk from his rear end down the side of it. You were against the wall. And if he wanted to really irritate you, he would squeeze you,
Squeeze you over there,
They
yeah.
knew what they were doing.
Oh, sure.
Yep, and put the oats and the hay
Yeah.
in there. So,
what kind of horses did you have? Do you know?
I don't know what kind you would call them. One of them was a great big old, her name was Ruby, and she was younger.
Mm-hmm.
The other one was a dumpy old plow horse, and that was Bess. And they weren't paired or anything. They didn't even look alike. They were just horses, but they sure did the work around there.
Yep.
They, same thing. They were in all winter, but they were out in the pasture otherwise. And they could go out a little bit in the snow. You used them some in the winter too. You would go out and twitch logs and things in the woods for them.
Right.
As I've said, we did cut some timber, and we would twitch it to the marshalling yard and build piles of trimmed logs, or even pulp. You would take it and cut the pulp into sections, and you would measure your cords by how high the pile was and how long it was. That's how you measured a cord. And we would put those in the marshalling yard until such time as we could come in and get the thing hooked to or hauled out, and we would haul it out. We used the horses to come in and take logs occasionally, and take one of those logs out and take it down to the mill in downtown Portage and get it cut into lumber. And you only took what you needed until summer. Then you could use a little Caterpillar tractor that we had, and then you could hook it. But these horses were good. I remember one time when old Bess was going along the trail, walking, doing her job, pulling out logs and what all, and it had packed down underneath their feet, and it sort of over the top, and she fell, and the snow was deep, and she couldn't get up. You talk about a rigmarole that we went through trying to get that horse back on its feet.
It's a big animal.
It's a big animal. And we finally did. She wasn't hurt or anything else, but just the difficulty that a farmer back in the old days would run encounter, what he would encounter just in daily life. And it's a problem that had to be solved because the darn horse will die.
Right.
If you don't get it up and moving again. And but they got around. But we used the horses for practically everything. We used them to run. We had a mowing machine for hay, to cut hay. You could hook the mowing machine behind one of the horses, and as the horse moved, the blade would go back and forth and cut it off right next to the ground and fall down, and then you'd put it up in bundles and load it in trucks after it had dried out and everything, and haul it to the barn. But I remember one time, learning experience for me, we were way out in one of the back fields cutting hay and bringing it in. And I had graduated. I was all probably 6 years old, but it's time for him to learn how to handle horses. So I was taught how to throw all the equipment onto the horse, harness and everything like this, and hook that up to the mowing machine. Actually, it was the hay rake that I did most of my work with. And I would do this. And it was my job to go on up and run it through the fields and bundle it up into these windrows. And they would come with rakes behind me, hand rakes with pitchfork.
Mm-hmm.
And they would take these windrows and pile it up as stooks of hay, and so that you would have these little beehive things sitting all over the field drying out. And I had Ruby, the big, black, slick, young horse, hooked to a hay rake one day. And the main road to go to all the properties back on the farm was just a dirt road established by traffic going over it. That's what it was. And of course, water ran down that thing. It was sloped to the west, and you were going downhill so that it washed in every rain and got rutted and everything else. And I was raking hay with Ruby in the field way back. It was half a mile maybe down in there behind the house.
Mm-hmm.
And as we were raking hay, the bridle broke on Ruby's harness, so that I had no control over where she was going to go.
Oh.
I couldn't pull back to tell her to stop running, to stop. Whoa! You couldn't. I had no control over the horse.
Mm-hmm.
A horse's instinct is to go home.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just what she did. She headed across the field. A hay rake is nothing more than two wheels on a shaft with these tines, which you would trip up in the air, and you would let the bundle of hay come out with the tines and then go back down again on the other side, and you would rake another area until you needed to trip it. And other than that, and the harness that was hooked to the horse, that's all there was, except for one iron seat that sat in the middle of this rake. And you were sitting up there on this thing and driving the horse, which was fine, as long as you had control of the horse. Well, Ruby took off to the barn when this bridle broke. And my grandfather and my uncles, I had two. I had my grandfather's brother in the field with us, and my uncle, granddad's son, my mother's brother, all saw what had happened. And they started out running and hollering at me. And I don't know what they were trying to tell me to do, but I was trying to hang on. That's about all I could do. And we began to get on that road out there. The horse, he was just instinctively going back to his stall up there. I don't know what he was going to do with the rake when he got there, or what he did with it. I didn't quite make it.
Yeah.
But boy, I went through one of those wash ruts in the middle of the road and pitched me right over into right behind the heels of the horse. And boy, they thought I was dead. And what happened was, and I swear this must be what it was, when I went over head first like this, I fell into one of these wash ruts. It was in the road, so that the tines of this rake went over the top of me. I came out with a cut on my lip.
Yeah.
But one of those tines could have cut me in the eye. It could have cut me in
just
the
been
chin
shredded right
anywhere.
up. Yeah.
But shoot, the next thing they knew, they'd look at me and they thought he was dead. But he bounced up, and here I was chasing the rake up the road. And boy, they got up there and they said, "Why didn't you let it go once you were safely off the thing?" I said, "Well, I didn't want the horse to get hurt or anything." I said, "I didn't know what to do." This is one of the few times I ever saw a doctor come to the house. They called him, managed to have him come up from Ashland to take a look at me, and found no broken bones, nothing wrong with me. It was one of those learning instances, you know.
Yeah.
But And I was real proud of the fact that I could handle horses, you know.
Sure.
Yeah, 5 or
Well, at
6.
that age, that's a big deal.
Yeah, it is. But I learned something here. They treated me like one of the men. If I could do the man's job, by golly, I was the man that did that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I learned confidence and that I could do certain things.
Mm-hmm.
Something that I was aware that I was the stranger on the farm. I was the kid that went to school down in Holton. But I was up on the farm and I was playing. And so I always kind of felt that way, and yet they treated me like he's one of the people. I imagine that may be because my Uncle Ralph was handicapped. He was a hunchback. And they were used to having him around.
Yeah.
And they'd raised kids of their own. And they knew how to handle somebody. But to have my uncle, my mother's brother,
Right.
treat me as an equal too.
Mm-hmm.
I learned all kinds of things about self-confidence. And I know I was so proud in one instance. I had been playing softball for a team that we had organized, kids, back at Holton. And the town was divided into about 5 sections, and each of the sections had its own softball team.
Yeah.
And we were just rinky-dinks, you know. We'd have a pair of shoes, some of wood, some wouldn't. Whatever you had, you used. You used sawed-off PV dog for a baseball bat and all this. But
so what is that? A sawed-off PV dog? What is that?
a PV. This is something they use in the woods to handle logs, timber. And what it is, it's a long pole. It's shaped like a bat, only bigger. Down you get down to the end of it, and it's a big blob. But it's hooked to a metal arrangement down there that goes down and has a pike in the bottom of it, and a hook over the side.
I've seen those.
So that you drive that pike into the log and let the hook come down, and you can take that log and roll it over. When you get stuck with a log somewhere up there, you are awful glad that you're able to turn that log and move it out of its position. But that's what a PV is. So if you take it and cut the mechanical part off the end down there, you're left with a baseball bat, although it looks like a telephone pole when you're going to use it. But at any rate, I got to telling the kids on my team, I said, well, I'm going to be going up to the farm. I'll be up there most of the summer. Well, we played the Northern Sluggers here in softball, baseball is what it was. And you're our pitcher. What do we do when it comes time to play the Northern Sluggers? And I said, I'll tell you what. I said, you keep me informed on all that's going on and everything, and when I'm needed, and you tell me when the Northern Slugger game is going to be played. I said, I'll buy a bus ticket and take a bus all the way down the Holton, play that game, and go back on the bus. To make a long trip. I had never made a bus trip before in my life. So I was a big man from out of town. They were bringing in eighth pitcher. I pitched this game. I think I lost it too.
When you bring in a ringer, he's supposed to be good.
Of course, the kids on the other team knew it. And they said, oh, Fred Bagnall's coming back to town. We haven't got a chance. Well, they did. I probably had horse manure all over my boots.
Right, yeah.
Well, that's just one little incident that tied itself in. But
how old were you then?
Oh, I was still 6, 7, maybe older.
Yeah.
By that time, I would have been in junior high school.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 12 or so.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was going to say 6 or 7 is a little bit much on the bus, but 12, yeah.
I think it.
Especially if you've been driving the horses for a while, you're pretty comfortable.
Yeah. Yeah. But I used to drive those horses, and with if I were going out to spray the potatoes, kill the potato bugs and things with the DDT.
Mm-hmm.
You used a team. Had to hook them up side by side with a wiffle pipe tree.
Mm-hmm.
Well, all paraphernalia. But I learned how to harness the horses and throw it over there, and how to hook it up to all the various things. It's a menagerie, really, to hook those things together. You take a look at one of these rigs that they haul a stagecoach on their old westerns.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there they use 6 or 8 horses. Well, that's nothing more than working the reins through all that business, and it's the same hookup all the way. But ours was straight hook up to the piece of equipment itself. So I used to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And we used to have certain properties. One of them, I think, belonged to Will Ross, the fellow from downtown Portage, that we had a field way back in the woods. I don't know why they originally cleared it, but they did, and had to use it as a field for potatoes off and on. I used to go way back there. It seemed to me as though it were 3 miles down in the woods that you went. And I would go down in there and cut hay, or rake hay, or whatever we were going to be doing down there. You would rent these properties, or they would rent them to you, and you simply pay them, or produce something on the farm, and they take the profits off the thing and pay you a salary for working it for them. We had one of those there, and up immediately north of my Uncle Ralph's property, that was just adjacent to my grandfather's farm, was a town dump. No big elaborate thing, just a dump. And beyond that, you got to the community of Buffalo. I don't know if it was incorporated or anything else, but at any rate, there was a large farm there. It may have been 200 acres. It may have been 100, I don't know. But it too, I think, belonged to Will Ross. And we almost always had at least one field up there that we would put oats and things into. And I loved to go up there. I used to take the hay rake or whatever, right out on the highway, the road that went in front of our house, and go up there. And it was 2 or 3 miles, I'm sure. And go up, and I would do the job up there, and I would. The whole farm was slanted up to the east this way, and it was bent down toward the west, toward the road. And I would get up there and rake up and downhill. And I loved it because the view was sensational. I was looking down in the valley down there, going downhill, and it's the foot of Portage Lake, with all the little streams and things coming into it, and the trees and the vegetation, and I thought that was the most beautiful thing. And there was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres down there in this headland or footland or whatever it was of Portage Lake. And I used to come down that hill and I'd start singing. And I would sing everything I knew, and you could hear it all over the hillside. And I was partly singing from just the joy of seeing these things.
Yeah.
This was one of the impressions I remember to this day, is really moving me.
Mm-hmm.
Plus the fact that there was a little house on the other side of the road. And I knew there was a real cute little girl that lived there with her family. I never did see her, but I said, I'll try to sing loud enough so you can see what
The voice didn't impress her.
I was human after all. But that was one of the chores I had, and I used to relish it. And I used to be so proud that they would trust me to take both horses.
Mm-hmm.
Without the horses, the farm would go out of business, I think. They had troubles with it.
Mm-hmm.
They had a tractor. It was an old farm-haul tractor. Mm-hmm. And it was, my uncle constantly worked on that tractor to keep it running. But the big jobs, or the hard job, doing the plowing, or something like this, he used to use that, and he would hydraulically hook up the plows on the tractor, and you probably seen many hookups like this.
Sure.
And but harrowing, hay raking, dusting potatoes, you use the horses for that. They did a very adequate job, and they knew how to do it better than you did. But I was so proud.
Yeah.
The fact that, again, they trusted me, and I was confident. And I think that part of my pride and confidence came from the fact that they would let me do it. And they didn't worry about me being up there all alone 3 miles above the full well knowing that the previous summer earlier I'd gone through the hay rake.
He won't do that again. He
learned his lesson. Never do that again. No, that was fun once, but I thought, it's like the kid picking up the horseshoe. A little old guy in one of these towns, he went by a blacksmith shop, and the blacksmith was in there twanging away on his horseshoes and everything, and dunking them in the water when they were red hot. And the blacksmith dropped one of the horseshoes on the and the kid looks at it, and he reaches over and picks it up and God, he burned his fingers and everything else, and he dropped it in the pail of water and hit his hands behind his back, just bursting not to cry. And the farmer said, what's the trouble? He said, you dropped the horseshoe. It didn't take long to look at a horseshoe, so. It doesn't take long to look at the horseshoe.
It doesn't.
But that wasn't me. That was a story. I enjoyed hearing because if it had been me, I'd have done it,
How many places in the world would coming from Holton make you the city kid? The city kid comes up every summer to work on the farm. He's from Holton.
I heard him on the radio when they broadcast basketball game. Back in those days, you almost had to have headphones. Because, no, it's not that bad. But they had a radio in the house, and we all used to gather in the living room and sit around on the floor anywhere and listen to the radio and the news. And, during the period of time when Dad was in Europe, you wanted to know what was going on over there, whether you won any battles or whether you were getting clobbered or how many people were killed. And I still can remember the announcer on the radio saying, "This is Gabriel Heater. There are war clouds over Europe tonight." And for years, that was his introduction to his newscast.
And you couldn't know exactly where he was either.
No.
So if there was a battle going on, you probably imagined he was probably there.
Well, you assumed that
he was somewhere fighting.
And because really, a letter from him I wish, and maybe there is a letter somewhere, but we have. Whether Mike has got it or whether it got lost along the way. But one that's got the blackouts in it, set around, and it looks like a telegraph. But in there, there'd be 2 or 3 words you could read.
More blacked out than the ones you can see. Yeah. Huh. That's a long time without much communication.
Yeah, it is a long time. None.
Yeah.
No communication. You can't pick up the telephone and call.
Right.
You can't click on the hand thing. You can't. There's no contact.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if he was part of that.
Mm-hmm. Now, how many years would that be?
Well, he would have gone over, and I was thinking of this the other day, and I think I had it pretty well figured out. I was born in 1934. It would have been around 1939. I would have been 4 or 5. It would have been probably between 1940 and 1945. I think the war was over about 42.
Right.
So right in that area of the early 40s.
Mm-hmm. But then he didn't come right home the day they declared.
Right, but it wasn't long, as I recall it. When the war was over, he came home, and all of the guys did. You see these pictures of the sailors and people kissing the girls. Well, this was after that war. It was over then, and there was no dwelling, wasting time, signing papers and all this business. You got your orders and you went home.
Mm-hmm.
Today, I think that's one of the reasons why soldiers complain when they're in the war, is they don't know what they're fighting for.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't really know when it's over.
Right. What's the objective? And if we can just do it, then we can go home. It gives you drive and purpose.
Yeah.
That's interesting. And so you just were on the farm that whole time?
Yeah. I was there for several years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. As you came in from the outhouse door, you came through the shed, and you came into a hallway. And in the hallway, to the left immediately, there was a outside stairway that went up to the second story, completely unhoused.
Oh, okay.
Now, this was inside the house.
Mm-hmm.
And so my Uncle Herbert, his son, when he got married, they moved into that upstairs, and it's where Uncle Ralph lived for a lot of years. It was considered his, and a stove up there, cast iron stove, and the whole business. And but I didn't go up there a lot, but I was welcome when I did go, and I did go up once in a while. But you go down that hallway, and on the right-hand side, there was the creamery, and there was a door on the creamery, and you didn't open the door because this is where my grandmother made her cream or butter. You go in there, and she had wooden, what they were was just hinged pieces of board that you could clamp them around butter shaped, and it would give you a pound of butter. Those things were pure white. She had scrubbed those to the point where they were perfectly sanitary. And that's the reason that you didn't go in her creamery, is because she did not want you in there with all of the clean things.
With your manure boots.
Yeah. The churn was in there with the great big iron paddles. And you would see the clotheslines hung up in there where she'd taken each individual part of that churn and washed pieces, hung those up there where they would air dry and purify as best they could.
Mm-hmm.
And but she used to make her butter in there. And then she'd wrap it in sort of a cellophane paper, wax paper or something.
Something crinkly, like?
Yeah. Yeah, it's stiffer than some,
Yeah.
but it was pliable too. And when
So help me picture this churn.
pardon?
Help me picture the churn. You've described it taken apart with the paddles, but how did it work?
Yeah. They had electricity.
Okay.
So there was electric driven because they ran a radio and but they didn't have a lot of electricity.
Mm-hmm.
But they grew into it, sort of.
Yeah.
But what with the churn, there was a motor on it, and what it was a great big tank.
Okay.
And you would pour the milk and the cream and what all she put in the butter and a little bit of salt. She had a recipe that she used to make her butter with. And you've seen an ice cream maker where
Yes.
they've got the thing that
Where
goes
they
across
go
over
this-
the top, and right, they hooked paddles to that,
Uh-huh.
and only they were big. They went clear down into this tank, which was essentially the butter churn.
Sure.
And then you turn on the motor, and those paddles begin to go around, and they turn and turn and turn until the milk curdles.
Mm-hmm.
And you wind up with the butter forming, and you pour off the buttermilk.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we used to throw it away. A lot of places they lived to get a hold of buttermilk like that, you know.
Well, Grampie liked butter.
Yeah.
My mom liked buttermilk.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure she learned it right there.
Yeah.
And but that's a place where there always was pure cream.
Uh-huh.
Because it came out of the separator that you use to process the milk.
Mm-hmm.
You put the milk in the great big drum on the top of the separator,
Mm-hmm.
and you put the milk in that. And actually, that's all the processing it went through. You take the milk right out of the cow, and you would put cloth,
Mm-hmm.
real fine mesh cloth,
Like a cheesecloth kind of
cheesecloth.
Mm-hmm.
That's the word I was groping for. They put it over one edge of the bucket and pour it through the cheesecloth. That's to fish out the manure and the bugs and everything else that happen to fall in there. And so that you've got the milk is in that tub up there. And you crank it up. And it swirls. And the different densities between the milk and the cream would drive the cream into one exit point went through a spout to the outside, and you could fill your bottle right there at the spout. All right, and the milk, being of a different density, would be thrown to the other side of that spinning arrangement, and you could bottle your milk right there.
Yeah.
We used to watch this operation, and we used to put the caps on the bottles. So this were the days when all milk was bottled, and it had a paper cap that you pushed into grooves on the top. And we as kids used to say, how many of these caps can you put on this bottle by jamming them down? And we used to say, there you get 4 or 5 of them.
Yeah.
There are people opening the door.
There's another one. It's like a magic trick.
But yeah, fun.
So that no pasteurization, just straight.
No pasteurization. I've wondered about that ever since.
Well, there's a new part of the system now. They pour water in and sell it as skim milk.
Yeah. No.
Yep, you got milk or you got cream.
Yep.
And that's what, yeah.
What is the lack of pasteurization? No wonder they pasteurize milk
Yeah.
eventually.
You've seen the other side of that cheesecloth.
Yeah. Because we used to just take it and spin the cream off, bottle it, take it down to the grocery store, or they would drive up in the yard and pump the horn. They wanted milk delivered right to them. Yeah. But everybody in town got it that same way. There was no difference. There was no type 2 milk or 3 milk or skim milk or buttermilk or any of this. Yeah. I'm surprised that they didn't do more with the buttermilk, but that was beyond my capability of understanding.
Well, if there was a market, I'm sure they'd have sold it. The same reason that you don't throw anything away.
Yeah.
So wasn't there something about your grandmother and the butter for restaurants? Am I remembering correctly? She sold her butter to restaurants?
I don't know that she ever did.
Okay, I'm misremembering. Okay.
Well, she may have, and you may have heard from my mother.
That could
something
be.
that I remember. Yeah. But you would go by that creamery, and actually, the other door opened to the outside, right out to that grove of trees where we picnicked and everything else. That was, that wasn't the only door. But it was the logical door if you didn't go through the creamery.
Right.
You would make butter to get to the picnic. You go to the end of this hall and you walk into the kitchen. And here on the left, you had an iron sink. And you had pails of water in there. One of them, you washed your hands and everything else. And you washed right there in that sink. And along the top of the thing, a whole series of hooks with tin cups on each one. Everybody on the farm had a tin cup hanging up there. You knew whose was who. And you could go over there and there was a dipper in each of the pails. And you would take your cup, you would fill your dipper and do this. Wash the dishes right there in the iron sink. And you would move on to the upper side of it, and that's where you had the separator for the milk. And that was in the corner. Then you started to cross the wall, and you went across until you came to a doorway on the other side of the kitchen from the hallway that you'd come out of. And she had built-in cabinets. It was that way with the house. This was the logical way.
Right.
But they started clear up at the ceiling, and the ceilings were up there.
Right.
And you would, all of the dishes and everything, the pots and the pans and you name it, were all there. Some of the groceries were there. There weren't an awful lot of groceries that were brought into a house in the farms in those days. Some.
Right.
But then you came to the door going into the living room, or the front of the house. This contained the living room and all of the bedrooms, and the stairway going downstairs to the cellar. But when you get to the doorway, the next little section of wall, the corner, and around the corner in the kitchen on the wall was where the baking was done. And they had the barrel that was hooked up down underneath the counter. It was on a swivel so you could open that door and the barrel of flour would come rolling right out so that you could reach down and get it, put it up on the top, and the top was laid out so that this is where they made the bread, and they made bread about every day, maybe more. And so it was there, and all of her spices were in a cabinet up above, and she had everything that she wanted for space. This was my grandmother's place. She handled the creamery, and she handled that baking cooking. And but I always liked that barrel arrangement.
Yeah, that's pretty ingenious, isn't it?
Ingenious way for somebody to come up with.
Yeah.
And it worked. I can't think of anything that would do the job better other than, okay, you've got a mechanical thing that dumps it down here and weighs it and all this. They didn't have that.
Mm-hmm.
But she made do with what she had.
Yeah.
And she would tell my grandfather what she needed, and it would be up to him to fabricate them.
Figure out a way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, you come to a series of windows that look out over this picnic area,
right,
out on that side of the house, and a great big round table. She used to regularly feed about 12 people at every meal, be it hired hands, be it us that were visitors, be it her family that was there, be it my Uncle Ralph, be it Uncle Herbert, any of these people. They were right there, and that's where they would sit, and that's where they'd sit and commiserate. And in the corner, they had an electric icebox, or electric refrigerator. They had graduated from the icebox to a refrigerator. And it had a round set of coils on the top of the refrigerator.
Okay.
And this was the refrigeration system, was the circulation of air through this thing and down into the, it wasn't the most efficient in the world, but it was one of the early refrigerators.
Interesting.
And so you had that. Then the next thing you had, occupying most of the wall, was the cast iron stove. And the rest of it over to the hallway that went on into the shed, and an outhouse and all that business down there in the creamery. You had a wood box, and it was a good-sized wood box.
Yeah.
Because I had to fill it 2 or 3 times a day. And, but...
if you're going to eat your bread, you got to...
Yeah. But the stove, of course, was cast iron. And there were 2 just heating plates.
Okay.
All right. And you had the burning section. It had 2 openings in the top. You would have a poker that would open up the lids and you would put the stove in. Or if your firewood happened to be on the stout side or have knots in it, you could open a door in the front of the stove and put one of these gnarly things in there and close the door. You could burn and use those too. This was fine. Then the other key, well, there was up above, you had a heating unit up there just to utilize whatever heat happened to get there. And you had the oven down below. I remember it had a great big ampersand seal in the middle of that doorway. And I used to be fascinated by that. I didn't know what it stood for or anything else. I used to sit there in the winter and look at that on the door. Oh, that's fine. Then on the end of the stove, you had the big iron tank. And this is where you heated all your water. You didn't do anything to heat it. You utilized the heat coming off that stove.
Right.
And you washed your dishes with it. And whenever you managed to work a bath into the system or the rotation, you do it. And but that was it. You couldn't all. That's why they duplicated. 2 or 3 people might take a bath in the same water, because the tank will only hold so much, and it takes a long time to heat it. So you either pick your times carefully. When all the men were out in the field, you go in and take your shower, or what? But you go out in the shed again, where I told you they had the machine section and the overhead and all this business. The back part of that was the woodshed too, between the shed itself and the outhouse. But the whole area in there was where you put your split wood to keep it dry through the winter. So you would fill that thing chock full of wood during the summer, and the yard out in front, it was full of chips, and that's where you did all your woodwork out there. And you would take it into this woodshed and put it in there, and then fill the wood boxes from there. We'd go back into the living room in the house now. You're sitting around listening to Gabriel Heater. And fine, you continue right straight. This is in the long direction of the house now. You had the master bedroom. That's where Grampie and Grampie slept. There was another bedroom just beyond it. Guest bedroom, I guess you call it. All right. Then you were coming back toward the living room again. The door came out into the living room. And there was a stairway going upstairs. Right there in front of that guest bedroom door. And there was a door opposite the foot of the stairs that opened to the outside and that picnic area and the trees. So there were two ways to get there. You could go out that way, or you could go through the creamery and go out through her butter making operation. No, you never went through the butter making operation, but where she did it. If she wasn't making butter, it was a different situation there. But upstairs there were 1, 2, 3 bedrooms up there. And right at the head of the stairs, or up above the stairway, they had their moose head there, and you would swat the flies and things that were flying around it as you went upstairs. And something that I always remembered was that they also had in my bedroom, and it looked at me all the time, I was scared to death of it, was a stuffed owl. He sat in the corner of that room and watched me through many a night.
That's funny. So who cared for the chickens?
Okay, my grandmother
I wondered if that was part of her realm too.
Yep. I used to do a lot of it, but I didn't feed the chickens. She went down and she fed the chickens. I would gather the eggs, and I didn't particularly care for that because you had to go into the hen house, which was right at the head of the machine shed. And you have to reach down in the nest underneath the chicken and steal the chicken's eggs. Well, those are supposed to be chicks.
Right.
And you take them and they're no longer chick, they're now eaten. And so I would go down there, and there were some of the chickens that were very docile. You would go ahead and you'd take their eggs, and they got used to it. But one of them, she used to give me a beating every time I take her egg. And other than that, each one of them had its own nest, and each one of them knew its own nest. And I don't know that we ever cleaned the nest, but it was right there. And I assume we did change the straw in it and what all, but on the other side, you had to roost. And during the course of the day, the doors were left open so the chickens could run all over the yard and everything else that chickens do. And but the roost went the whole length of the building, and 4 or 5 tiers high, and it was not one of these 9-mile operations that you have up there in the Midwest. Up there in the farms, some chicken houses would give a farmer 100 chicks for nothing, and they probably took the broiler-sized chickens and you raised them. But you got the eggs at the time.
Mhm.
You just raised the chickens, and at that point they would take their share as profit.
Mm-hmm.
But I can remember when the chicks would come, little tiny yellow chicks,
Yes.
just you beep 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 beep, and you get 100 of them stuck in a great big paper box. You had to set it in the kitchen,
Mm-hmm.
right next to the stove where it would
Keep
be
'em warm.
warm for them, you know. Yeah.
And then how did the potato operation go?
Pardon?
The potatoes. How did that process go?
Okay, that's what they did.
That's their main business, right? Is the
Main
potato.
business, they would go out and they would plow the field. And they would either do it themselves or they would hire hands to take potatoes and cut potatoes so that there was an eye in every section, at least one eye in every section that they cut. What they would do is take a knife and tape it to the top of a barrel.
Mm-hmm.
And they would use that knife, they would slide a potato through it, and they could guide it everywhere.
So they'd move the potato rather than the knife.
Yeah, the knife was there, but they directed the potato to it. At least these fellows that got ours, I watched them. And then they dropped right down into the barrels. You had barrels of potatoes ready for seed.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you do it right just before you're going to put them in the ground so they're fresh and don't rot or spoil or anything. But they would do this wherever you happen to have in a potato house. We had no potato house. You had to rent one downtown next to the railroad station or wherever they were.
Mm-hmm.
And but that's where the seed came from. They used your own potatoes, and that's how you controlled what kind of potato you raised.
Right.
You know what was good in that particular field, so the soil must be right for that type of thing. You had Red Mountains, Katahdins, and various types of potatoes that you had. And all right, one more building. And that cluster that they had that we had on one side of the great big area where I pulled the horse down across, just on the south side of this was a machine shed. And in there, they used to park any mechanical equipment that they had. And it wasn't a lot, but that's where they parked it. The plows and the harrows and different things like that. And they could work on them and clean them up and get them ready to go out and do the work in the field. I lost the important part of what I was going to say. I've forgotten.
Well, you got there, we were talking about potatoes and cutting them for seed and then maybe planting or harvest maybe.
Yeah.
Is that where you're going?
Yep. Okay, you come to the end of that machine shed. And that's all it was. It's just a place to park all your machinery and work on it. That's what I was going to say. They worked on it in there and made repairs to it. Okay, there was a driveway going right down beside it, on the west end of it. And the chicken house was right behind the machine shed, and the pen closed in behind it for the chickens. Then you came to a nice little house that was there. This was where he parked his tractor, and it was in good shape. He worked on the tractor all the time, but that's where they kept it. And that was the equipment that they had. He'd bring it out and he took it on whatever equipment he wanted to haul to the field. So you've got the seed. What you have to have is fertilizer, is the first thing. Well, first you have to prepare the field. You have to hook the plows onto either the horses or the tractor.
Right.
Go out, plow the field. And up there in Aroostook County, this was a problem
Yeah.
because there was no good farmland up there. It was bad stuff. Ledge, rocks, things stuck up through the ground, and more equipment was broken and destroyed trying to maneuver around this closely and yet utilize as much of the area as possible. That was one of the big hazards of being a farmer up there because it destroyed your equipment. And it was right in the middle of your field. And you never could make a thing of beauty out of it unless you removed it. And I guess after the big farmers came in, they probably removed these things. Although this particular farm is now grown up in pine trees and everything else, the government paid a subsidy of so much when you weren't farming land. Put it to use for trees, and they get money from the government for raising trees. So it worked out well. It was a good program. And but back to the field now. After you plow it, you've got to loosen that soil and make soil out of it.
Right.
So you put a harrow on it and draw the harrow. And again, horses or tractor. You take it over and a harrow, I don't know if you're familiar with them or not, it's like 100 spikes poking down through a metal frame. And you haul it over the thing so that all of these spikes, as the harrow is pulled over it, are broken up. And you spread it around. And
so on a smaller scale, the plowing is like when we would turn the soil over with the fork, the spading fork. And then the harrow is like when we go back with the rake and break up the chunks. Okay. And it's just much bigger operation, but it's doing the same thing.
That's it exactly.
Okay.
And at that point, you're ready to go in and plant. So again, you get a planter. And what that amounts to is a machine. Right? And again, tractor or horse. And it's got 2 tanks on it. One of them you fill with potato seed, cut up seed that you've had cut. The second one you fill with fertilizer. And as you haul it, the plow blades on the bottom separate the row. And a good person running this thing, that's where your true rows come from, is making them straight. And you go down and turn around and come back, and it'd be a thing of beauty when they get done with it. But they take a great deal of pride in what something looks like at the finish. And you part the soil, and as you part that soil, one seed every so far. And a little bit of fertilizer is drilled in. I'm sure we measured it somehow or other. I don't know that.
Is that fertilizer mainly manure then, or?
No, this is dry.
Liquid or dry?
Dry.
Okay. So it was a purchase.
That was a purchase thing. It came in bags, and you take the bags and break them and put them in.
Because I know, like a lot of corn today, the seed is purchased, but I'm guessing back in those days, they probably were growing their own seed corn too. But the fertilizer then you would purchase is probably very similar.
Your manure is limited. We had a manure pile on either side of the barn, one next to the horses and one next to the cattle. And when you had manure, we took the spreader out and used it on the field. I don't know how he designated to me where he wanted the manure placed, but it was apparently he saw that there was a deficiency in the potato yield or something in that particular area. So that's where he would utilize his manure. They seem to appreciate this as being the prized stuff to put on your field. And so that was the manure part. It was important, and they saved every scrap of it. I used to drive the manure spreader. I was a good manure man.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's what will get put on the back of your next sweatshirt, manure man.
Yeah, that's it. It'll go next to the lump on the back of my head because there's a whirling blade that throws the manure up in the air and spreads it. Well, shoot, up there were rocks and everything. When that thing would hit a rock, you'd come zipping by your head.
And you're already hoping Bath Day comes soon after that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, you go up there and you spend the summer working all summer, you might get one bath.
Yeah.
What you did, you got your bath down in Portage Lake. So you would go down to the lake and swim around the wave of water and get cleaned up that way. But, you had a clothes wash shortly after being on the spreader.